So, for those who do care, what are some intuitive approaches we can use to help folks who are mentally ill, not comorbid in the other respects that I mentioned, like homelessness or drug addiction or history of like violent crimes and etc. How do we help them attend to their terrifying, persistent delusions and psychoses? And why would anyone be allowed to have these data streams that are totally personal, that will be have unusual causality and will just cause them nothing but pain and anguish?
It's not so much the word allowed isn't really the right word. That's, data comes from one of three places: the larger conscious system, other IUOCs, or yourself. Most of that data is coming from themselves. They're creating that reality for themselves. And it's not coming from outside. And in order to get them to stop creating that, it takes some time. You have to work with them to get them out of that mindset that creates that kind of dysfunctional issues. There's fear there. There's lots of fear. You have to deal with that fear and start working. What are the fears? And how do you help people get out of their fears? Well, the first thing you do with them, how do you interact? How can you be part of the solution rather than part of the problem? I'd say in general, with people like this, you can be part of the solution by giving those people some respect. Treat them with respect. Don't treat them as though this is a sick person who's loony. Hey, Looney Tunes, how you doing today? That sort of thing. There's no respect in that. That's degrading. And people tend to do that. They give these people nicknames that are not positive and that kind of thing. Our culture tends to do that, you know, which makes them cower back, which makes them angry, which sometimes makes them want to fight, and then we have to put them in an institution because they're violent. So if we could just give them respect as individuals and realize they're different and that's okay. And if we did that, then there'd be a whole lot of them wouldn't end up in the institution. If we could, so I'd say that's just the first thing. Respect people who are different than you. Let them be different. It's okay for them to be different. Now, if they come, break the windows in your house and come in shooting with a gun, and if they're doing these things, then obviously they have to be stopped, and it takes force to stop them. We're not talking about that. We're just talking about people who, in general, are just very different than us. And the first thing our culture does is tease them, ridicule them, give them a hard time, punch them, slap them,
Take advantage.
laugh at them. That's what we do to them. And that makes them withdraw. They soon become victims. And when you're a victim in your own mind, that's kind of the worst place that you can be. Well, they are victims. That's true. But even the fact that you are a victim, you should not ever become a victim in your mind. You should never accept that victimhood because that's dysfunctional itself. It's really hard to get out of a space where you see yourself as a victim. You can see yourself as mistreated. You can see yourself as mistreated unfairly. That's fine. I'm treated unfairly. But as soon as it's, oh, woe is me, and you get wrapped up in self-pity, now there isn't any way up. You've just shut off all your channels for getting out of it, getting out of that box. You're just stuck in that box because once you get to that self-pity, you no longer have agency to do anything. You're just a helpless victim with no agency to change anything. And then you're kind of lost. But people who are a little different, we ostracize them, we laugh at them, and we generally are we hurt them. You take particularly young kids, you take somebody who's different and the older boys will punch them in the arm or knock all their books out of their hand or You know what I mean? Just nasty little things that they do just because they can get away with it. Knock them down, trip them, call them names, steal their papers, and just that kind of stuff. Well, that's what these people who are different go through. Now, how do you expect them to act? Well, most of them withdraw, and pretty soon they withdraw out of the society and out of the culture. And when you withdraw like that, you start making all your data streams up yourself. You've withdrawn, you've let go. You let go of the culture. You start living in a little fantasy land, some safe place. You don't want to join the cross country team. You don't want to do anything. You just want to keep away from people who taunt you. And eventually you might get angry, or you may be totally so withdrawn that you don't interact. You can't hold a job. You can't be around people because people frighten you. And now you're mentally ill. You get put in an institution. And a lot of times it just never would have happened if they'd been treated with respect in the first place. They're just different, but that doesn't mean they can't contribute. They can't connect. They can't have a very profitable life and learn things and whatever. They could if we took a little bit of effort. But when you live in a society that is very self-centered, we don't think about other people. We don't think about what is it like to be them. You know, we don't have that sense of caring for other. We just care about ourselves, and makes us feel more powerful if we can slap somebody around or tease them or make their life difficult. Then we must be stronger. Makes us feel more powerful because we have this power over this other person. So that's what happens when you have a population that's very self-centered. They just don't care about other people, and they make themselves feel stronger and better by putting other people down, by hurting and pushing other people down. So if you happen to be one of those odd persons, maybe you're odd just because you're very sensitive. Well, very soon you'll start having a hard life in public schools. You'll start getting teased, and you won't want to go to school, and then you won't want to go out at all. Pretty soon you're seeing a psychiatrist. Now you have a history of mental illness. You can see how that builds, and it was just because you were sensitive, perhaps. So these things start often with something very small. That's why I started. It's our culture. If we had a different culture, we wouldn't have nearly so many people with mental and emotional and spiritual illness. We have so many
Unfortunately,
because we push people into that role, into that realm. So now you get somebody who's like that, and they're very timid and they're afraid, and they live in their own, they've retreated into a life inside their own head. And sometimes that life is scary because they've had a lot of scary experiences. So there's demons in there, and there's awful things that taunt them, and that's what they got on the outside, and that's what they create for themselves. And the reason they do that is because they tend to believe in their own worthlessness. You see? So when you're treated badly and you're young, you don't come to the conclusion, people in my culture are just self-centered. You know, it's not about me, it's about them. Well, that would be true. But when you're young, you don't come to that conclusion. When you're young, you come to the conclusion that there's something wrong with me. I'm not right. And the kids pick on me because I'm not like them. I'm not as good as them. I'm a failure. And you start seeing yourself in negative terms. And then you begin to dislike yourself because you being the way you are causes all these social problems for you. You want to be somebody else, but you're not. You're stuck with this person, and pretty soon you see this person you're stuck with as an awful person that you don't want to be like. So now what kind of imaginings are you going to have? What kind of things are going to go on when you're the creator of your own data stream? All kinds of negative stuff because you feel like you are a nothing. You're unworthy. So you beat yourself up. You're constantly having negative kinds of traumatic stuff going on in your mind because you don't like yourself very much. Because when
And
you were young, everybody told you you were defective. You know, you weren't right. You weren't good enough. And like I say, you may not have been anything other than a sensitive personality that cared about people. And that's what happens. So if we were to grow up, our culture was to grow up, the mental health problem would probably reduce by 70% or something. We wouldn't have nearly, you'd still have some. There are some people who are just truly dysfunctional. You know, the brains don't work right. They can't function very well. There's some who are so mentally disabled that they can't trust themselves. They can't feed themselves. You know, obviously these people need a lot of attention. And if you have in our culture, mom and dad both have to work. Otherwise, you know, the other kids don't get fed and don't have a place to live. So mom and dad have to work. Well, what do you do with a child like that when mom and dad both have to work to feed and house the other kids? Well, they go in an institution. You know, that's what happens to them. Whereas if you had this like it used to be, you know, you had mom and dad and grandma and grandpa and a couple of uncles and cousins all lived in the same house or at least the same neighborhood or that kind of stuff, then okay, you know, somebody could take care of Billy, you know, and maybe Billy could even be found to be able to go fetch firewood or, you know, do some kinds of things that were useful and he'd be okay. You know, you wouldn't have to get rid of him. But in our culture, we don't have that. We don't have that kind of a place for those people. Mom and dad both have to work. What are they going to do with this kid that daycare won't accept because he's too much trouble? Goes in the institution. And then in the institution, he gets treated with no respect. He learns to hate himself, disliking himself. He creates all this other stuff. They put him on drugs. And you see, it didn't have to be that way. So that's, yeah, when we say that this mental health thing is very complicated, it's because a whole lot of what we see as mental health problems are problems with the culture. They're not just mental health problems, they're cultural problems. A culture that is not very grown up, is very self centered, and a culture that is so driven by a dysfunctional economic system that there's no room for those kinds of people. If you can't get out there and earn money and get a job and be a productive part, then yeah, they throw you in a hole someplace. You know, you go to an institution, and those institutions get minimal funding. You know, it's that sort of thing. So you get minimal care, and that's just the way it is. We throw away the people who aren't productive because our economic system is all about productivity. Whereas caring and families and people aren't just about productivity. You know, they're also about love and sharing and taking care of others. It's not just about productivity, but our culture is very productivity oriented.
yes, I wanted to, before I ask a question about victimization and especially self-victimization and trauma, I'd like to comment on in two ways. In that, a lot of the people that succeed in working long term for the service of the mentally ill tend not to be very empathetic because they have about them this coldness that allows them to continually work around suffering because they're just disinterested in it, and they have very little interest or ability to empathize and not much creativity in that sense.
Yeah,
Um,
Yeah, well, that's true of some professions. Doctors are like that too. Take physicians. Physicians, well, if they're skin doctors or, toe doctors, foot doctors, not so much. But if they're doctors that say do a lot of open heart surgery and other things where, 20% don't make it. So when they're doing those kinds of things, a fair number of their patients are going to die. They're going to work and do what they can, but the patient's going to die. Mostly oncologists, that work with cancer victims, the great majority of their patients are all going to die. So they distance themselves from that emotional set of, being empathetic to those people. Yes, they're polite. Yes, they're considerate. They're all those kinds of things, but they don't connect emotionally because in their line of work, oncology would be a really good one, wouldn't it? Most of those patients die. So not all of them do. Sometimes, the stage 4 cancer got 3 weeks to live, cancer goes away and they walk off fine. But that's a rare circumstance. So dealing with people that, are, well, you have 6 months to live, you have 3 months to live, your lifespan is probably about 2 years, yours is about 5 years, and a lot of their patients are like that. So you're working with people who are on their way out, they're dying. You wish to make them comfortable. You wish to give them as much good quality time as you can with the science that you know, but you don't connect to them emotionally. You don't have a lot of empathy for them. They're just your patients. You do your best you can for them, but it's all out of your intellect. You're not emotionally connected with them.
What do you think caregivers are leaving on the table by doing that? What would
Well,
could the consequence be if they did care from an intuitive point of view? What energy could they
well,
give to could it
yeah.
significantly affect their prognosis, their survival rate?
The thing, one thing that is a downside of that, you have to understand that they pretty much have to be that way in a sense that if they got really emotionally connected to all their people and all the great issues those people have and are trying to figure out and trying to deal with their own deaths and deal with their families and deal with the children they're leaving behind and all of these issues. If they got personally involved in that, they would not be good doctors. They couldn't function in their profession. They wouldn't really help anybody. So that's part of being in that profession is that you kind of are cold in the sense that yes, you're nice, you do what you can, you're personable, you try to be helpful, but you don't get involved. You don't really connect to them as a human being. You don't do that because you can't afford to. Now, if you're a surgeon, that sense of being detached from those people is necessary. If you're a doctor, if you're a surgeon and your children need surgery or your wife needs surgery, you get some other doctor to do it. Doctors don't work on their own families. Surgeons don't work on their own families. Because why? Because they do care. They are involved. And because of that, they're not going to make as good of decisions. They're going to second guess themselves. Well, should I do that or should I do the other thing? But what if I'm wrong? You see? Well, if it's somebody they don't really know and they're not connected to, they will just intellectually, they'll do the best thing that has the highest probability and they won't hesitate. They'll just move on and do it. And it'll come out however it comes out, and that's good. But if it's their own child, they can't do that. They're emotionally involved in it and they're unable to be as effective a physician. So physicians doing real serious kinds of operations, they don't do it on their own families because they wouldn't be as effective as physicians. So physicians have to have that sense of detachment from their patients in order to be a good physician for that patient. In other words, they stay connected. That doesn't mean that they don't care about the outcome. They care a whole lot about the outcome. They want these people to survive. They want their surgery to be effective. They do care about it, but they're not personally involved in it. If that person dies, it's not like they're going to have to stay away from work for a week, because they failed. They've got more people they need to work on. They have more people they need to try to help. They can't get that involved. Otherwise, they lose their effectiveness. So with mental health, it's not quite the same. It's not life and death most of the time that we're talking about. But if you are in that business, what you need to guard against is being negative. After a while, you get kind of snide and kind of negative, and you like you say, you give people nicknames, and oh, that's Looney Tunes, and that's Goofball over there, and you start looking at these people in a negative context. You start seeing them as dysfunctional people that kind of don't deserve the same kind of human connection as other people do. These are damaged people. And you will find then often in these institutions, people who've been there for a long time are the ones that treat the inmates harshly, treat them badly. And that's where you get your it's not the guy who's a new hire that does that. Usually it's the guy that's been there 30 years or 20 years. And he's so putting a barrier up between himself and them, but then his own self-centeredness and his own lack of growth comes out as a kind of hostility toward these patients. You see, it's his own lack of growth. So, yes, the patients have self-centeredness just like the culture. Self-centeredness is everywhere. And when you're the orderly or the doctor or the person that has to deal with these people, and particularly if you're the guy that has to grab them and hold them still while somebody else gives them a shot, well, after a while, your own self-centeredness makes them the enemy, sort of. They're less than you. And that's how you justify you're going in and grabbing them and holding them still. If you've really had a lot of empathy for them, you'd have a hard time doing that. So in your own mind, you say, well, that's what they need. They need that shot. They need to be held still and whatever. And then after a while, the neutrality tends toward negativity. And people who are in that profession a long time, they start to get a negative attitude toward those people. And they don't have much respect for them anymore. They're like dysfunctional machines. Certain things need to be done. But when those people do things that particularly cause them extra work, like they decide to, poop on the floor or something, now somebody's got to clean it up. Well, the person who has to clean it up gets really irritated with it and then has a negative attitude toward that person because it calls them extra work. And next time they walk by him, they might just tend to slap him on the back of the head or something. An organization that does this has to be looking for that. They have to be aware that the people who've been there a while get desensitized to these as human beings and starts to get negative toward them, particularly if those people are very self-centered themselves. Then it can work that way. So a lot of these institutions, jails are the same way, right? You get a lot of guards who are very abusive of the prisoners. Well, you get people in mental hospitals that are very abusive of not the prisoners, but the patients in there. And that just tends to happen because those abusive people are very low quality of consciousness people, and they see people that cause them extra work, and they want to get even. They want to slap them back, because they're low quality people. So, yes, I think anybody that's worked there very long needs to be watched to see whether or not that kind of negative stuff is coming out, or whether or not, or the administrator in charge needs to be aware of that fact, that the people he hires are likely to be self-centered, because our whole culture is self-centered. Everybody's self-centered.
I could imagine that when one is able to work in these settings successfully, you have a tremendous opportunity for not only observation, but lowering your own entropy, because you're constantly having to exercise tolerance and having to try to offset the callousness of other staff. Um, what do you
I
think
would
about that?
I would agree with that. I think it would be a great place to learn and to grow up if you can stay, to where you have respect. Each one of these people are there for whatever. There's all sorts of things might have bounced them into that place, but there's a fair chance that the thing they did wrong was no more than just being different. And that being different caused them to be picked on, caused them to be smacked around physically, and all that started then to lead to their mental illness. It's not like they had mental illness. They became mentally and emotionally ill because of them being picked on and hit and other sorts of things. And, that it was a kind of a culturally induced mental illness, if you will, with somebody who was very vulnerable. So when you realize that, then it's a little easier to have compassion for these people and to treat them with respect. Oh, how are you today, Mr. Smith? You treat them with respect, and they will appreciate that. And yes, they will pretend not to hear or not to care when people treat them badly. They'll pretend, they may even laugh or pretend to take it, but it hurts just the same. So just because somebody acts like, oh, they don't matter, it doesn't bother them, it probably does bother them. They pretend it doesn't bother them because otherwise they get more of it. So yes, respect, caring. I think you have to stay a certain amount of emotional distance because you can't get too involved with their personal lives and what they are. You can be helpful, but a scene just jumped into my mind at Robin Williams in it might have been his Patch Adams film. Didn't that Patch Adams film have a sequence where he put himself into a mental hospital, and he basically put himself in it so he could get out of it if he wanted to on his own too. But he just he was a different person. He was different, and he just needed to rest, have a little R&R, and he went into this mental hospital. Um, and there was a guy there who was kind of had a room next to his, and this guy was terrified of something. I don't know what it was, squirrels or some kind of critters, and he would pretend that these critters would terrorize him, and they'd come, and he'd have to fight with them and get rid of them. And remember that Robin Williams, this guy was doing that. Watch out, there's the squirrels. They're coming after us. So he jumped on the other side of the table and turned over the table, and he and this guy, shot the squirrels and vanquished the enemy together, you know. And as it turns out, this guy knew that that was all. The guy who was doing it knew that it was all just in his mind. But he was so touched by somebody else, not just making fun of him, but actually joining his imaginary thing, that it kind of helped him get out of it. He kind of let it go. He just kind of realized what it was. He was making this up in his mind because it was just part of what he was filling his day with. And part of these things that were the enemy, that was probably himself, and all of his dysfunctionality was probably what it was. And he was just going through this stuff. So that's because he got respect. The respect is, sure, I'll help you. We can beat the monsters. And then they both kind of giggled about it afterwards, because they both knew that it was silly, but it was fun, and they just played a game, and there was no harm in it. It's like, it's okay to do that. It's not a big deal. So that was very helpful. So as I recall, while Patch Adams was in that mental institution, he helped a whole lot of the people in there while he was there, in the film, just by interacting with them with respect. Not, you're crazy. There aren't any monsters here. Go back to bed. That doesn't help.
To me, it's the joy of working in this field, and that I try to agree with people unconditionally that, yeah, that is your experience. I can't deny that that happened,
Mm-hmm.
even if it didn't, occur in our shared objective reality. You really feel like people are after you. That's a horrifying way to have to live, a sense of paranoia with you at all times. But I hear you. I understand it. That's really tough. Of course, I can't be with them in those moments when they're in crisis, but I've had a lot of success just telling people that, yeah, I get it. That has to be hard for you. And, given my limited scope, because I'm, at the place
Right.
where they're institutionalized, that touch for them makes them feel seen, heard,
Sure.
understood. And I just, we're even discouraged in some way from forming um, these types of bonds with patients at times, not where I work, but I've heard in the past you want to be careful about that because then there's someone that they'll like more than others. And we all have to be on an even field of like professional distance. Whereas I think there needs to be, breakthrough people who will unconditionally try to accept them, hear them out, and empathize creatively. Because Lord, if it was my life that I was, say, constantly, beaten up and ignored, and was, felt just totally tossed aside, and then I had to accept, physical abuse from even friends and someone who could act something like a brother to me, I might retreat into my own mind and feel that nothing in my life will ever be but abuse coming
Right.
somewhere. And if that could be me, then this could be, my brother in that spiritual sense, that other life I
Sure.
could have lived.
Sure.
It's very sad to consider that, but
Yeah.
actual, and that's where we can offer an olive branch and a bit of, compassion.
So that's the respect I'm talking about. Just treat them with respect rather than treat them as defective people. Treat them with respect. And yes, of course, those people will like you better. They will like being around you. They will like interacting with you. They will do things for you that they won't do for the other people because you respect them. Well, the answer to that isn't that you need to stop respecting them. The answer to that is the other people need to learn how to respect them also. They should all be respected. Everybody that works there should give these people respect as individuals, with issues, but no need to keep piling on the disrespect and the negativity. That certainly isn't on anybody's path to recovery, is other people piling on more negativity toward them. So just acting positively toward them, not being above them. You put yourself above them. I'm up here and you're down there, and you need to do what I say. Now all you are is a heavy. You know, you're the you're the bouncer. You're the heavy. You're the guy that's going to get them and make them do what you want them to do. And that's not a good position to be in. I don't think I'd want a job like that. But if you can just work with them and respect them, and like you say, yeah, I can see that's pretty tough. Having that kind of a problem. You know, I don't know what the psychiatrist is supposed to do. You're not a psychiatrist, so they probably don't want you talking to them about, well, when did that start? When did that happen? But you,
If
you
I definitely
could.
want to ask the question about trauma, because I'd like to bridge between, people who are, for decades institutionalized, and, those who deal with these things more of mood disorders, depression, or
Hmm.
are depressive. If I may ask, um, how does it feel for you to talk about this? And have you, in your life, being such an unusual person, or in your past, however far back that extends, have you suffered in this way, being someone who is so unusual, and who's known that?
No, I never have suffered any thing about that. It mostly my unusual I kept to myself, and even from a very young age, when I had very unusual experiences, I just didn't share them. I may have tried to share them once or twice, maybe even with parents, when I was going out of body, when, like 6, 7, 8 years old. But I think I quickly learned that they didn't understand. It wasn't part of their experience, and they couldn't understand it because of that. So there was just no point in talking about it. And I had no need to convince them. It was part of my life, and that was okay. And it wasn't part of their life, and that was okay too. So I never was too concerned about being different. I always thought that being different was an advantage, that my differences were all advantages, not disadvantages. I liked being different in that sense. I got to go out of body and do these kinds of things, and they didn't. So I'm different. That's good for me. I get some extra stuff that other people don't get. So I always had a very positive attitude toward uh, my my differences, and mostly I don't show them, don't talk about them to people. It's one of the things people keep asking me. Tell us stories. Tell us about some of your experiences out in the larger conscious system. Like Bob Monroe did. Bob Monroe told us all these stories about his experiences out there, and you won't tell us any stories. But I don't like telling people stories. I don't like sharing any of that because if I was sharing it with other people who had had similar kinds of experiences, oh, I would talk very openly about it. But I'm talking to people who have never had those experiences. And that forces those people into the space, particularly from our culture, of believing it or not believing it. Okay, so if they believe it, then they think that that's the way it is. And if they try to go out of body, they're going to see the same things I do. Well, it's not necessarily the case. It's not the out of body realm is not like Chicago. It's not a physical space where everybody that goes to Chicago sees all the same buildings. In a non-physical space, that isn't like that. So that would make their own growth more difficult. And the people who disbelieve it then usually will come to some negative kind of conclusion. Oh, he's just making that up, or he's delusional, or if you don't believe it, then I'm lying. And so you come to some negative. So either you believe it and you misunderstand the nature of the reality, or you disbelieve it and become negative. Well, there's no advantage there. It's not a positive thing. So I don't share it. It's when I work on people, if I'm doing healing and I heal people, I never mention that to them. I get all kinds of people write me and say, "Oh, this is happening, that's happening. Can you help with this and help with that?" Most of the time, I do help, but I never say, "Yes, I'll try to fix that," or "I'll do that," or "Yeah, I worked
Uh,
on him. I think he's better now." I never say any of that. I just, okay, I take in the information and I just stay quiet about it. But mostly, I do help, but I don't talk about it because it isn't helpful to talk about things to people who don't have personal experience. Again, if you don't have personal experience, then it's not your truth. It's not your experience. It's not your truth. If it's not your truth, you can believe it or you can end up with some kind of negative attitude toward it. I'm sure there's millions of people who think Bob Monroe was some kind of psychotic goofball who had hallucinations. By definition, if you look at our culture, by definition, Bob was a guy had hallucinations, and he wrote books about his hallucinations. How quaint! So okay, he wasn't in an institution, but he could have been under other circumstances if he wasn't wealthy, if he wasn't an old wealthy white guy, right? He could have been in an institution if he was a poor guy lived under the bridge and talked about all those things that he saw, they may lock him up somewhere.
You're
So,
gonna be schizophrenic, you better be good at business.
yeah. So, in any case, it's I don't think it's there are also a lot of people that believe Bob Monroe and everything he said, and they're trying to do what he did, see what he saw, and they have trouble with that because it's personal. This is subjective. This is the world is subjective of a mind. We interpret things. We use different metaphors. Even if we get the exact same data stream, even if we see the exact same buildings in Chicago, it's mental stuff. We'll interpret them differently. You see, we will give them different metaphors to describe them. And so to us, even if it is the exact same data stream, we'll see it differently. And if it's not what Bob described, then, well, that must not be right. But it is right. You just have different metaphors, different ways of understanding, different ways of explaining things in your own mind, a different experience base for which you do your pattern matching. And, it's all personal. So everything's not just the same. Whereas going to Chicago, here are the buildings, there's the observatory, there's the big tall, office building, and then okay, there's the waterfront down there and the little drive going along it. And sure, everybody sees those things because that's the way it is in the physical world. That's the objective world. Those are all objective things. But when you talk about an out of body, now you're in this subjective space. And subjective space is not like Chicago. It's very different. It's very open to interpretation and to different backgrounds, different metaphors. It has different meaning to different people. And even has different meanings to the same person at different times. It's different. So to give people the idea by giving them the description of all the things you saw, that's giving them a description of your own personal metaphors in your personal space. It's not going to help them really understand very much. So it's, I don't like to share things like that with people. So mostly I keep my mouth shut, and that keeps me out of institutions.
That leads
Because,
me to ask my question. It's
yeah,
because of childhood trauma, you won't share it. I got it. No, I'm kidding.
I never had any trauma in childhood. I have had a very positive, very functional life. I grew up in a very functional family. I was successful in school. I was successful in graduate schools. I never had anything that was dysfunctional really going on. Everything in my life was mostly positive. Now I'm rare that way. Most people don't have that kind of experience, but my parents were very good parents. Um, you know, I had some, the high school I went to was a terrible high school. It was very substandard. It was basically a country school sort of things. Most of the people in it were going to grow up to become farmers, but it had a small academic class, and out of that academic class of maybe 20 people, um, I I and one other person that I know of went to college. It wasn't that they took academic because they really didn't know what they were going to do. But anyway, it was a factory town, a farming town, kind of thing. So the quality of the instruction there was very low. So when I got to college, I had to work real hard because I had a lot of catching up to do because I didn't really have a real good education in high school. Well, yeah, so I did. So when I was a freshman in high school, I worked 16 hours a day. I ate, I slept, and I studied. That was it. I didn't do anything else. My freshman year, I studied from, as soon as I got up, I was working on the books, and when I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore, I'd sleep. And I did that basically for a year. And by the time that year was up, I caught up.
In college.
Yeah, in college. So I just caught all that up, and you know, I didn't really feel that so much a hardship. I just knew I was going to have to work my tail off to catch up. with an education that wasn't as good as the other people that I was starting with. So I just worked harder than they did. And I caught up probably after the first semester. I was pretty well caught up. It doesn't take too long to do that. And then afterwards, I had a pretty good study ethic. So then I got ahead. And I stayed ahead. So things were pretty easy. Geez, when I was a senior, I took 21 credit hours, instead of the usual 16 or something. I took 21 credit hours and graduated. Well, except for my freshman year, I was always 3.5 or better, so I graduated with honors. So you fix problems as best you can, and I've never, so I've had some things that weren't necessarily always, a golden, fed with a golden silver spoon, and I had stuff that gave me places where I had to come back from, from being in a hole, from being in a deficit, but I never had any trouble catching up. It just made things a little slower than others. I have dyslexia. Um, I had some other odd things. I don't know. I guess if you were a psychologist or a psychiatrist, you'd know what they mean. But I have. I was almost 50 years old before I could memorize which was my right hand and which was my left hand. Really, I'd have to go in my mind. I'd have this little thing. I'd go in my mind, see myself throwing a ball, and then I would see that I was throwing my ball with this hand, and I knew that that must be my right hand. So when somebody said turn right, I'd first have to go into my mind, throw a ball, see which hand I threw it with, and come up with which way was right. And I got to where I could do that pretty quickly, but I couldn't just memorize it. For some reason, that memory wouldn't stick. It's not like I just knew that this was my right hand, and I memorized that as a fact. That was just Teflon coated fact that I just could not keep track of. Somewhere in my 50s, that went away. I being a physicist and math is my thing, right? I do a lot of math and numbers, and sometimes I'd look at a number and I'd say, is that a 6 or is that a B? I couldn't, that's the dyslexia, I couldn't tell the symmetry from right to left. And I'd look at it and I wouldn't know. I say, well, which one goes which way? One of them goes this way and one of them goes that way. But for the life of me, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference. I'd have to go find a book that had a number in it to see which one was which. Oh, yeah, 6. Okay. 6 goes this way. All right. And then I'd go on. But 10 minutes later, I could look at it and I wouldn't know. Is that a 6 or is that a B? I wouldn't know. So just because I looked it up and just know that fact wouldn't stick. So basic things like that, it's kind of dyslexic. Things would be symmetric, 9s and P's, 6s and B's, anything that could be flipped around right to left, mirror images of things. I couldn't keep them in my mind. I never knew how old I was. I couldn't keep track of my own age. I'd have to calculate it. So somebody said, how old am I? I could tell them with plus or minus a year or two, but I didn't know exactly what it was. I'm 21, 22, somewhere in that range. That's what I knew from my memory. But to actually know whether I was 21 or 22, I'd have to calculate it every time.
This
Even
is
if somebody
fascinating.
asked, even if somebody asked me that, and an hour later I got asked it again, well, maybe an hour later I'd remember, but next day I'd have to calculate it,
And
and
this is
those things
a
didn't stick
nuclear
with me.
physicist who worked on large scale system simulations, the smartest
Right?
guy the whole community
Yeah,
knows.
yeah. But
It's
see, so
funny to
I
hear.
had some interesting things like that were just odd, but they make life sometimes a little difficult. That you get things wrong. You might get a test answer wrong because your dyslexia, flip something around and you saw 62 and you said 26, because you saw it backwards. Um, But I figured, you just, again, you work a little extra harder. It doesn't matter. You can overcome all that kind of stuff. It's not a big deal. You can deal with it. But it was somewhere in my 50s when I realized that I knew which hand was my right hand without having to go throw the ball. Why that wouldn't stick, why that one little fact wouldn't stick, I don't know. I could remember all kinds of formulas and equations and things, and I was terrible with names. Never was good at names. Hey, Tom, I'd like you to meet Sam. Sam, this is Tom. Hi, Sam. Good to meet you. But then I had no idea his name was Sam. I couldn't even remember it for 20 seconds. The name would just go right away. Now I would recognize him. And if I saw him 5 years later, I would recognize his face as that guy that or whatever. But the name, I didn't, I couldn't hold on to names very long either. I think a lot of people are like that. They have trouble holding on to names.
So when we have these quirky behaviors, I would think, because Lord knows my own self-consciousness in the past and my proclivity for self-directed negativity, that's probably the worst thing we can do, is to judge ourselves in the way that we fear society will judge us. Oh, you don't know your right from left? What are you, an idiot? We shouldn't do that, right? But we also don't need to attend to it, I'm assuming, because you would have, with our intuition by finding some way to rectify it so that we're no longer that way. Sometimes I guess we just have to accept these quirks. And
Just
what would you
accepted him.
say?
I didn't care much about him. I and my, I guess, particularly my younger son, Christopher, what we always said about Christopher was he had enough self-confidence for 4 or 5 people, and I think I was always that way too. I just always had enough self-confidence that, okay, certain things just don't stick in my mind for some reason, and it wasn't important for me to figure out the reason or to fix it. It's just the way I was, and I could get by without, with that issue. It wasn't a problem, and I just ignored it, dealt with it. That was just me. And I don't know, I didn't really talk about it. I didn't even think about it much. It was just one of those peculiarities that I knew I had to learn how to quickly figure things out sometimes. I had another thing that was a problem. I just was terrible at trying to memorize some kind of process. So, a lot of my other students, my peers in physics, they would memorize formulas and processes. Okay, if you want to solve this kind of equation, here's how you do it. You have this and this and this, and just like kids when they do arithmetic, they learn the mechanics of how do you multiply. You take this number times that number and you put it down here, and then you take this number times that and then you put it down here, and they go through the mechanics of it. They memorize the mechanics of it and they do it. I could not memorize mechanics very easily. I had to derive everything from first principles. That's just the way my mind worked. So I was slow on tests because I had to derive everything from first principles, whereas they didn't derive things from first principles. They just memorized, what the right answers were and how to get from A to B. They memorized that step to A to B. So they were quicker at getting right answers on tests, which made it easier for them in school. But once we got out of school, I was way out ahead of them, because when you're doing science in the real world, when you're doing physics in the real world, particularly not at a university, but doing things where you're the person paying you a salary needs an answer, and the answer needs to work, and it needs to be right. None of those problems are in school books. All the real world problems are unique. They're all different. You have to understand how to derive answers from first principles in order to get them. You go, and engineers are the same way. I know my son who hires engineers, he says he has a really hard time finding engineers who can think. He says that a lot of them are good at plug and chug, but he'll give them a problem that the company has. Here's a problem. And they'll say, well, I never read a solution about that. I don't know how to work it because it wasn't in any of my textbooks. And it's like, well, no, of course it wasn't in any of your textbooks. This is a real problem in the real world. And, go figure it out. And he says, mostly they can't figure it out. If they haven't been taught how to solve that problem, then the problem's just unsolvable. And he says, they're not any good. He says, it's like, they can't do anything useful where he works because there are no textbook solutions to anything that's a problem. If it was a textbook solution, it wouldn't be a problem. It would have been solved a long time ago. It's not a textbook solution to any of these problems. You have to understand the science and how to apply it. And I found that easy to do because that's what I'd always done. So then when I got to the real world of produce, you know, where you're on the line for results and production, not in school anymore. This is the real world. And, if what you come up with doesn't work, well, it's not useful. And in that world, I had a bright light because I could figure out what the answers were. I could understand how to solve the problem. And most of my peers couldn't couldn't figure out how to solve the problem. So it was that was a thing that was very difficult in school, because school you don't solve intractable problems, you solve textbook problems, and basically on a time basis. How many of these solutions can you get down on your paper in this much time? And my problem was every problem I worked I got right, but I only got half the test done. It's that sort of thing. So uh, I usually got everything that I did right, but I never got finished. I could never finish a test because I was slow. So yeah, I've had my own quirks like that, but they've either turned out to be not important or an advantage. So that's just the way my mind works, which is why really I was able to come up with MBT. It's the same thing. There's no pat answers to any of that. Nobody knew the answers to any of it. So where do you start with a problem that, for the last 100 years, nobody's been able to come up to an answer to it? Where do you start? Well, you have to start with fundamentals. What's fundamental? You start building up there until you figure out what the answer is. That's the way my mind works. So I was able to do that because I had the experience in exploring consciousness. So I had a lot of facts about consciousness that other physicists don't have. Matter of fact, most physicists deny that consciousness even exists. So I had all these facts about consciousness that they don't have. And it turns out that's what's fundamental. So if you understand that, you can derive other things. So I got those facts in consciousness because everything I experienced in working with Monroe and then working on my own afterwards, I had to understand. How did this work? Why did it work that way? What are its limitations? What else can be done? And I just keep chugging on that problem until I figured all those things out. And then I go on to the next problem. So that's just me. So it's not so much that I'm really, really smart. I don't necessarily think that I'm really, really smart. What I am is relentless and methodical, and I start with the initial stuff that and start deriving everything from there. That takes patience. It takes an attitude that can work on big things without getting lost in the details of those big things. So that's maybe, if you're thinking, you ask a question, if I kind of weird, does my weirdness, come out and cause me trouble? No, I am a little strange in many ways, but it's never been a problem. And I've always had plenty of like Christopher, I've always had lots and lots of confidence that, I could figure things out, or I could get there, I could do it. Okay, I have dyslexia, 26 becomes 62 or the other way around. And, I could look at it and see one and then look at it again and see the other. And now I wouldn't know which one is true, and but that I could deal with that successfully and overcome it. So if in my college career, I did graduate with honors, but I could have done a lot better if I didn't have dyslexia. I've gotten better on some of my tests if I could have done them faster. I did good enough. I didn't. It was good enough to get into graduate school. So that's it. So I think confidence helps a lot, and I was just born with that, just like Christopher. So if there was a problem, I never looked at it like, oh, there's something wrong. There's a problem. Well, then what's the solution?